Today we're going to talk about UV light implementation in air purifiers. Now, ultraviolet germicidal irradiation, UVGI for short, is used in industry to kill germs in circulating air or water systems. Now, for the rest of this video, we're going to talk about ultraviolet germicidal irradiation simply as UVGI. We're going to just use this short term there, UVGI. It's a lot easier to say, and ultraviolet germicidal irradiation is quite a mouthful. So again, for the rest of this video, we'll talk about UVGI when we talk about ultraviolet germicidal irradiation. In any case, UVGI is implemented in industrial air and water systems, as we just talked about, and it's implemented in a way to ensure that it's as effective as it possibly can be. And in order for it to be effective as possible, there are four components that we need to look for. The first is that the air or water is exposed to the light for a sufficient amount of time to ensure that the germs are killed. This is commonly called dwell time. It refers to how long the air is actually over the light. So what you want is you want maximum dwell time. You want the air to be over the light as long as possible. The second component that's key to a UV system being effective in this type of implementation is that the light is of a sufficient intensity to actually kill the germ. If the light is of too low a wattage, then it's not going to be able to kill the germ effectively. The third component we need to look for is that the air or water can contain certain particles, and these particles can actually shield the germs from the light. So in industrial systems, they need to take into account if there's any type of particles in the air or the water, how is that going to affect the UV light actually getting to the germ to actually kill that germ. And finally, the fourth component we need to look at is which germs are actually being killed here. Different germs have different resistance to different types of ways of killing them. So not all germs are going to be killed equally effectively with a UV light. So the type of germ involved is definitely another factor that needs to be considered as you're implementing UVGI in a industrial setting in an air or water system. So far we've talked about UVGI being employed in industry to kill germs. And now we need to kind of pivot towards how it's implemented in a residential setting in an air purifier like this one I have to the right of me. So in order to do that, let's go over those four components we just talked about, those four key factors in determining the efficacy of a UVGI system. And let's see how well an air purifier implements those four factors we just discussed. So of course, the first thing we talked about is that UVGI efficacy is dependent on the actual dwell time, how long the germ is over the light. And an air purifier can do this better or worse depending on several factors. One thing that can be done to increase dwell time is to simply increase the surface area of the light. So the larger the light, the longer the germ will be over the light, just because there's more light for the germ to travel across. Another thing that can be implemented is reflective surfaces. Light is obviously reflective, including UV light. So by employing different reflective surfaces inside the air purifier, that light can bounce around and have more dwell time over the germs. Finally, you can implement the light parallel to airflow. So as the air is coming in, if you implement the light parallel to airflow, the air is going to be over that light as long as possible once again. If it's implemented perpendicular to airflow, the air is going to go right over the light, and it's really not going to be over the light for very long. So that's definitely something to look out for as well, is the light implemented in a perpendicular or a parallel direction relative to the flow of air. So those are things to look for in an air purifier to make sure that dwell time is going to be as long as possible. So how do air purifiers actually do? And the truth is that the most popular UV models on the market actually don't do so well at all with this type of implementation. On the table here today, we have the Germ Guardian AC4825, and the UV light is actually implemented right at the top here. So this unit is a little bit unique in that the air comes in through the back of the unit and it travels through the front of the unit. The clean air is coming here through the front of the unit. So in the back of the unit here, there is a carbon filter and then a HEPA filter, and then the air is coming in through the back here. So all the air is getting pulled in here. The UV light is right at the top here. So there's an area up here where there's a metal shield, and behind this metal shield is the UV light. So in removing this metal shield, you can see up here, the light is right up here. So The interesting thing here is the fact that the light is not actually implemented in any way that you might want it implemented to be as effective as possible for UVGI. The light is up here in its own separate compartment. It's surrounded on 3 different sides by non-reflective surfaces. The metal shield here, on the inside of the metal shield, it is somewhat reflective. However, on 3 sides here, it's non-reflective. And the bigger problem here, though, is the fact that this light is all the way in its own separate compartment up here. So as the air is coming in through here, the light is completely isolated in the setup here. So for us, we really question if the UV light is doing anything at all here. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later on. Before we continue, though, we do want to note that there are other Germ Guardian models that do have a better implementation. The AC5250, for example, actually does have a UV light that extends lengthwise here down the back of the air purifier. And so it's really right there in the middle of things when it comes to the air coming through. And that type of implementation is going to be much better. The thing is that this AC4825 is very popular. It's a popular model for people looking for an air purifier that also has a UV light. And so the fact that it's implemented so poorly in this model is definitely noteworthy. And that is the reason why we use it here as an example today. Now, we just talked about how on this particular unit and other Germ Guardian units as well, the UV light is implemented quite poorly for maximum dwell time. And the fact is that that really isn't the biggest problem here. The biggest problem is the fact that these units are primarily used for particle filtration. The HEPA filter that fits in right here is going to capture particles. And the thing is, for that HEPA filter to be as effective as possible, the air has to travel through here as much as possible. So for maximum particle filtration, you want the air to travel through the filter, and you want that air to keep on traveling through the filter over and over. So as this air purifier is implemented in a room, eventually it's going to go through all the air in the room. And once it's gone through all the air in the room, it's going to keep on processing air in the room. And it's going to repeatedly process air in the room to keep on removing particles over and over. And the thing is, you want to do that as quickly as possible with an air purifier. The higher the CFM, the greater the output of the air purifier, the more effective particle filtration will be. And the problem there is that for UVGI, you want exactly the opposite. You want maximum dwell time. You would want the air to travel as slowly as possible. You would want as little air as possible per unit time to go through the system past the light. And so what we find is that particle filtration and UVGI are 2 opposing things. They require 2 opposing things in terms of what they need to be effective. With particle filtration, you want maximum CFM, you want maximum output, you want a maximum amount of air to travel through the unit as quickly as possible to really capture as many particles as quickly as possible. For UVGI, in order to kill germs, you don't want that same level of output necessarily. You want the air to travel more slowly, you want less air to travel through so that there's a maximum amount of time for that air to be exposed to the light to actually kill the germs in the air. Now, the second factor we talked about earlier that determines UVGI efficacy is the wattage of the bulb. And the fact is that units like this Germ Guardian, again, they just don't have very high wattage bulbs. And again, it's really questionable whether the bulbs have sufficient wattage to actually kill germs. This particular AC4825 that we have on the table only comes equipped with a 5-watt bulb. There's a smaller model, the AC4100. That model only comes equipped with a 2-watt bulb. So the wattage is extremely low on these models. And that low wattage, again, really makes us question whether the light can even be effective in the first place. Even if it were, let's say, implemented better in a better location in here, would it even be effective with such a low wattage? That's something that is a real big question for us. Again, for UVGI efficacy to be as great as possible, you want a maximum wattage bulb. You want a bulb that has as much wattage as possible. And these bulbs in here, in these residential air purifiers, are low wattage bulbs. The third factor that determines UVGI efficacy, again, is particle concentration in the air or water. Here we're talking specifically about air. And what happens is, as air is traveling through the system, particles can actually act as shields for the germs. So you want to have as few particles, as small particles as possible in there. And here, air purifiers do really well. Again, air purifiers actually are equipped with a HEPA filter that is going to capture those particles. So the particle concentration in the room is going to gradually decrease with an air purifier implemented. And by decreasing the number of larger particles in the room, you're decreasing the concentration of particles that are going to act as shields for the germs. So in that way, an air purifier does quite well for UVGI efficacy. Finally, we talked about how UVGI efficacy is dependent upon the actual characteristics and nature of the germs involved. And the fact is that here the air purifier can't do anything. It really comes down to the individual to know what type of germs are involved. In industry, you may be able to test the air or water system or test the surrounding area or have some understanding of the germs and the nature of the germs that might be involved in that system. For somebody at home using an air purifier, you're probably not going to have any idea what type of germs you're dealing with. And so it's really no fault of the air purifier, though, in that situation. The air purifiers cannot determine the characteristic of the germs and how effective it's going to be against those germs. The germs are just going to be the way that they are in the actual area where you're using the air purifier. So what have we learned so far in this video? We know that UVGI is effective. We know that UVGI is effective enough to actually be implemented in commercial settings, in industry, where killing germs is important. And we know that for sure. So it's not a question of whether UV light is effective in killing germs. It absolutely is effective in killing germs. Now, the fact is that we also know that residential air purifiers, for the most part, and definitely some of the most popular units on the market, such as this unit from Germ Guardian, those units simply do not implement UVGI very well. The fact is that, again, the location of the bulb, the direction of the bulb, the reflective surfaces around the bulb, the wattage of the bulb, all of these factors contribute to making the implementation in such an air purifier quite poor. So UVGI is effective, but its implementation in your average residential air purifier is not going to be that great, at least for some of the most popular units on the market. And lastly, we also know that UVGI and particle filtration are essentially opposing forces. For particle filtration, you want maximum airflow. You want that air to travel as quickly as possible, to be processed as quickly as possible. For UVGI efficacy, you want exactly the opposite. You want maximum dwell time. You want that air to really be exposed for that light as long as possible. And so UVGI and particle filtration are kind of two opposing forces there. And when it comes to air purifiers that are primarily intended as particle filters, this presents quite a problem right there from the get-go. So in kind of wrapping things up here, we want to make one final very important point. And that is the fact that you don't have to kill germs to filter them from the air. A germ is essentially nothing more than a particle when it comes to a HEPA filter. For you or me, for us to define different particles, we can say that this is a particle, that is not a particle. For the HEPA filter, anything that travels through there is a particle. And a germ has mass, it's an object in space, and as it travels through the filter, the HEPA filter is capable of capturing that particle, that germ. It's one and the same to the HEPA filter. And the germ does not have to be killed, it does not have to be dead for the HEPA filter to capture it. So what we're saying here is that the UV light implemented with a particle filter like an air purifier is essentially a redundant measure to remove those germs from the air. The germs are going to be removed from the air with the air purifier. The air purifier is going to be able to remove those germs. A UV light in this setting is redundant and it's not necessary. You do not need to kill the germs to filter them from the air. And so our bottom line recommendation when it comes to UV lights, UV air purifiers, UV lights implemented in air purifiers, when it comes to recommending UV air purifiers, we certainly don't mind them. This is a fairly good air purifier. It filters particles fairly well. So the UV light is not taking anything away from that. So we definitely would not say stay away from UV air purifiers. We would not say if you see a unit with a UV light, understand that it's probably going to be implemented poorly, and for that reason you need to stay away. That's certainly not the case. We would say that look for an air purifier that is going to be a good quality, that is going to have good energy efficiency, that's going to have good noise output, and that means low noise output. Look for an air purifier that is going to do everything that an air purifier needs to do very well. That's going to have the settings that you need. That's going to have a remote if you need that. That's going to have good gas filtration if you need that, et cetera, et cetera. All these other factors. We would stress those other factors in looking for an air purifier. And if the air purifier does have a UV light implemented, we would say that that's fine. That's not a problem, but don't rely on that UV light. Don't think that because it has that UV light that you're going to get that extra level of filtration, that you're going to get that extra level of air purification in the room. That's simply not the case with most UV lights implemented in residential air purifiers. So again, UVGI is effective. UVGI is not implemented very well in most air purifiers, but at the same time, UVGI is not really necessary with air purifiers. So what we would recommend is that you take a look at top-rated units. We will have a link to those in the description to this video. Those top-rated units may or may not have UV lights, but now you know that you don't really need a UV light for your air purifier.